Hello, welcome to this second video for CVSB 201. You should have already watched the plagiarism video and have taken the Socrative quiz. If you had any problem with that, I just would like to remind you what it says above the video, which is that although I believe in the video I said that the room name is CVSB 206, for your quiz, you will have to put in as the room name CVSB 201. Okay, so in this video, we're not going to get into the main reading yet, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Instead, we're going to start with talking about reading as such. In the first section of the course, in introducing the course, I already told you about how perhaps the main skill that you need to gain throughout this course is how to better read texts, right? And I explained reading a text in terms of being presented with a bunch of material that you do not understand, and in fact in which the first step is simply to figure out how to go about trying to understand it, right? So every text is different, as you will see, and every text requires different kinds of tools and methods for attempting to understand it. So it's not just that the text that you're presented with is complex and perhaps confusing, but you can't even assume at the very beginning that you comprehend what kinds of tools you need to apply to understand any given piece of text. So I'm just going to talk today about three types of reading, introduce you to them, and then explain some of the techniques involved so that you can better get a grasp on how to approach any of these texts that we're going to read in 201. You're going to find, in fact, that the texts we read in 201 are very, very difficult indeed. Not simply to read. Some of them are very fun stories. They don't appear, the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you read it, will be a quick read. It'll appear to be very simple, but after I'm done going through this reading guide here, I think you'll probably realize that the Epic of Gilgamesh is perhaps the most difficult text in this course to read. I'm going to send this document that I'm showing you now. I'll send it with my email today. This document that you're seeing on the screen is what I call a typology of reading, and an attempt to break down the different and explain the different types of reading. And I begin it with, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I begin with some kind of motivational quotes for trying to explain to you why such an exercise, a preliminary exercise talking about reading in general, might be useful. So the typology that I'm going to present is, in fact, based loosely on a famous book called How to Read a Book. And in that book, the author says, "I did not discover that I could not read until after I had left college. I found it out only after I had tried to teach others how to read." Of course, you might ask yourself, what is meant here? How can a person who has written a book, not only written a book, but written a book about how to read, be someone who had discovered that they did not know how to read, right? Even after they had obviously read many, many books. The answer to that puzzle is, of course, that reading, we tend to, and this author assumed that reading was something very simple. That's what they went perhaps into college thinking, that reading was simply a process of putting together the words on a page. Of course, we learn the words as we grow up and in school. We have our dictionaries, and simply, interpreting word by word, sentence by sentence, and simply putting together a kind of coherent picture of what the author was saying. And as it turns out, that assumption is simply false. So to read a text, of course, those are things that you have to do while reading a text, but reading a text requires much, much more thought and work, as we're going to see. And it takes a great deal of time and effort to learn the skills that are required for such reading. In fact, it takes decades for some people, including myself, to reach the kind of level of reading certain kinds of texts that we do and to study, and you'll see that in this course. The other quotes, I'm not going to read through all of these. Some of these are kind of interesting. The second quote here emphasizes how reading is kind of an act of civilization. Says it is one of the greatest acts of civilization because it takes the free raw material of the mind and builds castles of possibilities. Reading is you might want to think about this a little bit. Reading is the way in which we make contact with previous civilizations. It's kind of a time machine we can use. It's practically, aside from visual art and the study of architecture and maybe a bit of archaeology, it is the sole way in which we carry down meaning through the ages, and build up ideas and allow for civilization to change and develop and to grow. It's through this act of which only we can do, right? The texts can just sit in libraries for centuries, and if no one reads them, they have absolutely no value or use. The entire value of that information, the life of that information, is only possible and only comes to be in the act of reading it, of our actively going back and trying to interpret it. And that's part of what this quotation emphasizes. This third quotation, I picked it because it relates to what I will later call analytical reading, and emphasizes something that is important in order to understand what analytical reading is and why it's necessary. In this quote, it says, "That which is given has to be received, and the way in which it is received depends as much on the reader as on the text." So what this emphasizes is the active role played by you as the reader in actively receiving what is present in the text. So in other words, the person who wrote the text, and the text itself only plays one side, and perhaps the less important side, in the relationship between you and whatever comes to you through the text. You yourself have to put into the text all the meaning and all of the work in order to get out something from it. And what that means is what you get from the text is both limited by, right, and dependent upon what you provide, right? So it may seem as if when you read a text, everything is there for you to simply receive it. But the receiving itself, you receive it in a certain way. And you receive it only as you are skilled enough to receive it, right? Or in the way you are skilled to receive it. So if you do not understand a certain word, that word cannot communicate anything to you. That's maybe the most simple example. The final quote here says, "We create our own vision of the piece of fiction, our own dream, our own enchantment. We run a simulation on our own minds. As partners with the writer, we create a version based on our own experience of how the world appears on the surface and of how we might understand its deeper properties." This quotation emphasizes a related, kind of extends what is said in the previous quotation. The first quotation says that kind of what the text can say to you depends largely on you yourself and your skills and your understanding. And this emphasizes that, in fact, it goes even further than that the act of interpretation is a kind of creative act. It's an act that you are in control of, that you can develop and that you can perfect, hopefully, in this course. Part of that is recognizing the very fact that our own ideas, our own views, our own desires, our own moral outlook has an impact and limits the way that we can understand our texts. And that is a kind of a reflection we have to make on ourselves to realize that we are active. We not only have to be active in understanding texts, but that we are active even if we don't want to be. We are always reading ourselves into the text that we read. And if you want to read a text, not simply for pleasure, but also for academic purposes, for trying to figure out what the text is really itself saying and not simply what it might say to you, then you have to think about what those presuppositions are. Realize that when you creatively reenact, as the author says here, what's going on in a text and create a vision in your mind, that creation is limited by certain presuppositions and views that you have, and that you need to actively try to pursue a deeper understanding of those so that you can remove them from your understanding of the text itself and perhaps approach an understanding of the text in its own terms, right? And not as your mind and your prejudices and views might color it. So I'm going to begin. I'm just going to go through the typology here. I'm going to talk about three types of reading. There are actually four, but the fourth one I'm not going to cover in this discussion. As I said, this typology is based largely on what is found in this book by Adler and Van Doren called How to Read a Book. You can look that up if you're interested. Their typology is a little bit different from mine. Mine is inspired by theirs, but it's not exactly the same. Now, according to this typology, right, reading consists of four basic levels: the elementary level, the inspectional level, the analytical level, and the synoptical. And in this video, I'm only going to talk about the elementary, the inspectional, and the analytical. Now, each of these levels contains, so these are not separate levels, each level contains and improves upon and also corrects all of the preceding levels. So once you've done elementary reading and you move on to inspectional reading it includes elementary reading, and it in some ways raises it to another level, corrects it, kind of improves upon it. Analytical does the same with the other two, and synoptical again perfects and completes elementary, inspectional, and analytical reading. So what is elemental reading? The word element means first or basic part, beginning or principle. It's a very old ancient Greek term. The elements, as earth, wind, and fire, they're the four most basic components from which everything else arises. So elementary reading is similar. It's called elementary because it is the starting point or the most basic component of all forms of reading. When not contained or corrected by any other of the three succeeding levels of reading, elementary reading just means the following. Namely, being able to understand the language in which a text is written word by word according to the common or dictionary meaning. Right? So many times in this course, you will be forced, and you should follow that urge, to pull out a dictionary and to check what a word means. There's absolutely no harm in that. Abraham. There is no embarrassment in that. It's something that I have to do continually. Simply check what a word means. And when you're checking, of course, and this is when you're doing an elementary reading, all you want to know is kind of what that word means on the surface. So what its basic definition is. Of course, you might also want to be aware that the word may have different possible meanings, right? So, for instance, the word to entertain means both, could mean to, do something that entertains a person, that makes them, something for them enjoyable to watch, something like that. That's entertainment. But on the other hand, to entertain something can also mean to think of it in your mind, right? These are two completely different meanings. I could entertain people with a magic show, or I could entertain the idea of, going on a holiday. This is two completely different uses of the word entertain. That's one of the complications you have to keep in mind. Words often have multiple meanings, and which meaning is appropriate for the text is a question that so the second thing that this first or elementary form of reading means is being able to comprehend the connection of words in a sentence. Which adjectives modify which nouns perform which actions, which nouns are subjects and which are objects, etc. Thirdly, it means being able to decode the basic grammatical form of sentences, even when this is fairly complex. Now, at first blush, elementary reading may simply seem too elementary to be of much interest or to deserve our attention. But this is not the case at all. Indeed, I expect that you'll find that many of your attempts to comprehend texts go wrong at this most basic level. There are several reasons for why this is the case, why elementary reading, despite being elementary, is not, in fact, simple. As I already mentioned before, words often have more than one meaning, and older texts or translations of older texts tend to use English words according to meanings that are no longer common, and sometimes are not even found in current dictionaries. Sometimes you will not know that a word, for instance, has a secondary or a tertiary meaning, or even suspect such. So you'll just assume that it has the meaning that you've associated with it. Not only do words often have multiple meanings, but sometimes they have meanings that have been lost over time. So the meaning is just no longer associated with the English word, and so there was no reason you would even perhaps suspect. Of course, you may think, and what we'll see later, that sometimes your sense that there's something wrong with the text, or that the word isn't being used in the way that you would use it, that can often serve as a nice clue to send you off on some research about whether that word has other meanings, whether it has multiple meanings today, or whether maybe it had a previous meaning that it is now lost. Shakespeare's Hamlet, where of course we're not reading Hamlet in this course, but Shakespeare's Hamlet provides an excellent example of this, as do some of the older translations we will read here in 201. Both employ an older literary form of English, often using words in unusual senses that could mislead even your elementary reading of them. Indeed, even Shakespeare scholars sometimes have to simply guess what he is saying in certain cases. In this course, it's going to be even much more complicated than that, because all of the texts that we are reading are translations from ancient languages that we, in fact, know very partially. Think of the Gilgamesh text as translated from ancient Akkadian and Sumerian, languages in which many words are still of unknown meaning. The person who has translated this text for us has, in fact, made many guesses that may be wrong about the meanings of specific terms, and they've been forced to take these words that perhaps had a special meaning within ancient Sumerian culture and replace them with English words formed in the modern English Anglo-Saxon culture. So, for instance, we'll see that there are many terms like harlot, good, what is good, even that are used in the text in ways that don't seem in any way similar or have the same connotations as what we find in their modern English equivalents that are being used in the translation. A second reason elementary reading turns out to be so difficult and often is faulty is that authors themselves sometimes use words in special or technical senses, which they alone employ. So not only do you have to deal with the fact that sometimes the words are being employed in an old or in a more literary or complicated sense, but sometimes authors use words in their own special senses. So you won't even find those senses in the dictionary, and you simply have to piece that together and and come to the realization that they use words in that way by reading the text itself. So that's another complication. Third, as in the case of words, grammatical constructions and their significance have changed over time, differ between genres of literature, and often differ even from author to author. When you're reading an author, there is a certain skill to reading that specific author and no other. This is the same when reading Homer. There is a specific set of skills and strategies that are required to read Homer that will not be of use to you in reading Plato, and the same for Plato with respect to Aristotle, and so on and so forth. So every author, in fact, every book, in a certain sense, has unique features about it that require developing new skills that are maybe not even useful beyond or outside of that very book or author. Some lessons we can draw from these observations is that to prepare oneself for elementary reading, you should first inform yourself about the kind of text you are reading. When was it written? Was it written in English, or is it a translation? If it is a translation, was it translated long ago, and so in an older form of English, or more recently? What genre is it? Is it poetry? Is it philosophy? Is it a novel? Is there some reason to suspect the author uses words in an unusual sense? Perhaps a sense all their own. These are some of the questions that you should, that elementary reading and understanding elementary reading should kind of generate and lead you to answer before you even, open up a book. Elementary reading can be facilitated by noting key terms and trying to keep track of the ways they are used. And create for yourself a kind of dictionary for each of the books that we read. If you're reading Gilgamesh, that dictionary might include certain key concepts, like dreams or, hero or other sorts of terms. And that catalog in that catalog, you would keep track of where that term occurs throughout the text so that you can compare those different places to try to learn something about their deeper meaning. Such a dictionary could also include the names of the key figures, for instance, their main ideas, and so on. Particular attention should be given to cases where an author writes, "By X, I mean." This happens often in philosophical texts. You'll see this happens in Plato and Aristotle. They will often tell you what a word or term means for them. And in that case, it's very, very important to write that down, to write down that key term and its definition. Because elsewhere they may use that term in a different sense. They may not be consistent. That is something to look at. Elementary reading may require the consultation of specialized dictionaries, right? So it may require not only the use of contemporary dictionaries, but older dictionaries or dictionaries of special sciences or so on. Finally, elementary reading will very often have to be corrected later in the hierarchy of reading levels. Indeed, it is probably impossible to separate accurate elementary reading from the third level of reading, which we'll get to last today, namely analytical reading. So elementary reading is just that kind of first blush, attention to the text and an attempt to put meaning to the words. And already we can see that is something that on the first attempt is already very complicated and is almost certainly faulty, and needs to be corrected through a more careful attention to the text, which is what we carry out in analytical reading. Now, inspectional reading, I'm going to go through this very briefly because it's kind of more relevant to some of the other CVSP courses than it is here, but it is relevant when we read, for instance, Aristotle and Virgil and some of the other later texts. So inspectional reading. To inspect means to look at something or to examine something. Like a check-up at the doctor, they inspect you. Now, what does a doctor do when you approach them? Do they look at every part in complete detail? No, of course they don't. They check over the main and obvious parts. They take the most general and basic tests, and they use this to build a quick but also hopefully accurate sense of your overall health and any obvious problems you might have. In the same way, inspectional reading aims at a quick and overall sense of the main parts of a text, its general structure, the central goal of the author, and the way in which the parts are connected together to serve this goal. So in inspectional reading, we look at a work as a general whole, right? We look at it from the front, from the back, from every direction. We try to get a sense of the overall shape of what is going on. Often if the book is a story, you want to have a sense of the overall plot, right? But not only of the overall plot. Say the Odyssey has a certain plot where Odysseus travels, through various parts of the Greek world and returns home from Troy, right? That's a general idea of the whole. But how does each chapter individually, why are they divided into the chapters that they are divided into? And how does each of those chapters fulfill a certain function with respect to the whole of the story? That is part of inspectional reading. Here on inspectional reading, we kind of ask ourselves generally what kind of book this is, right? Why was it written? Here you can think about, for instance, some books have very complicated and interesting titles. Sometimes thinking about the title can tell us quite a bit about the book, because the title is in some cases, not in all cases, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We should think about that title, and I'll talk to you more about why that title is very important. But that's not the title. That's important because it's a title that was not given to the work by its author. But when an author has given a title to a work, they usually choose that very carefully. So surprisingly often, it is very useful to think about that title and what it can tell us. Next, inspectional reading. In inspectional reading, we read over the work's chapter headings, if it has them, and we think about their apparent order or relationships. I already mentioned that earlier. We carefully read the introduction, if the work has one, looking in particular for statements that reveal the purpose or the structure of the work. Often the main idea of the author is right there on the surface in the introduction. Afterwards, we compare this plan or main idea with the chapter headings to see how the author has implemented their plan. This can be both surprising and revealing. This is true as much of scientific writings as it is of things like the Odyssey, fictional writings, right? The Odyssey has, in a certain sense, even though it doesn't have a section that is called introduction, it has, in a certain sense, an introduction in the first book, right? How is the story introduced? How does that introduction, what does it tell us about the overall purpose and structure of the entire work? If we ask ourselves that question, we'll get much more out of those introductory sections. Finally, in inspectional reading, we carefully read any passages that contain a summary or synopsis of the results. This often includes final paragraphs of sections or chapters where the author tries to draw everything they've said into one summary thought. This is particularly the case in, as I said, scientific or philosophical texts, but also it happens very often in stories, in fiction, that the previous action is summarized by a character. Reading these can be very, very helpful to us, because that's the point where the author is trying to inform the reader about kind of what they should have drawn from all of that action, for instance. Also, sometimes that's very revealing, because sometimes that summary does not agree with what you would think that all that action was supposed to, the lesson you were supposed to take away from all that action. And when that happens, many more kinds of questions arise as to why there is that lack of harmony between what is told in the story and the kind of summary that is given within the story of what happened in the story previously. Sometimes that may be because that retelling of the story is actually a different part of the story. Maybe some character is trying to manipulate the story, or to lie about what happened in the story, or so on. So there could be many, many, many reasons. or one reason being maybe we misunderstood what happened previously. All the works in our reading have a kind of plan or goal behind them. In literary works, this plan may be very minimal or it may be lacking entirely, but it may also be very clear, and the author may explain the work's structure and purpose at the beginning and before each of its parts. Scientific and philosophical texts that we will read in this text nearly always have a clearly set out purpose or structure. Moreover, good authors are careful to explain their plans and to order the succeeding parts of their works in accordance with that. Now, some of the lessons we can draw from this kind of reflection on inspectional reading is that at this level, introductions or summary parts of a work are the most important and deserve careful dissection. Most of the work, when we're reading inspectionally, is simply skimmed through or even left unread. You're just looking for the overall structure, for instance, the plot. To reach a knowledge of that, you may just read the titles sometimes of the chapters. Inspectional reading aims to get the most information from a work in the least amount of time. Inspectional reading is not linear, but circular. You do not go from from sentence 1 to sentence 2 to sentence 3 as you would with elementary reading. You skip to the main and apparent parts. You look at them in different relations to one another, and then, after getting an initial sense, you skip back and forth between them, even reading the book backwards, or starting in the middle, always trying to get a sense of the overall plan and interconnection. Now, although this typology distinguishes inspectional reading from both elementary and analytical reading, it should never be truly separate from them. Obviously, elementary reading is required to understand the basic sense of such things as introductions, titles, and chapter headings, and inspectional reading may also provide clues to correcting our elementary reading. More importantly, inspectional reading often requires a more advanced or analytical reading of the main parts of the works. To get a quick sense of the whole may require a careful and detailed analysis of a short passage or even a single sentence. So ultimately, inspectional and analytical reading are interconnected, as we will see. So finally, analytical reading. Whereas elementary and inspectional reading aim at uncovering the first layer or the most obvious meaning of a text, analytical reading takes a critical look at the results of these other two types of reading and, as it were, puts them to the test. In analytical reading, we are driven by a suspicion, which almost always turns out to be true, that the text is more complex and deeper than we initially expected. As it turns out, our elementary reading of such texts, as we will cover in 201, will almost always turn out to be false, indeed often terribly false. In elementary and inspectional reading, we usually assume that, technicalities of word usage aside, the text is written by someone who basically understands the world as we do. But of course, this is almost never the case. Even if you yourself wrote a text 1 year ago, there will be ways of understanding things that you will not even share with that former self. You have changed in the meantime. So there will be some things that former self assumed and understood in a certain way that you understand differently. Now imagine how much you likely do not share with an author living over 5,000 years ago. That person lived in a time before science, before Christianity or Islam, in fact, before monotheism, before philosophy, before modern societies, before banks, hospitals, schools, universities, public transport, the concept of human rights, the concept of sin or of a soul. In fact, before just about any concept that you can think about was likely not available to them. So if you really think about it, you might even kind of despair of ever truly being able to read and understand the text that we want to cover in this course. And your pessimism would be largely valid. However, there are some things we can do to try as much as possible to prevent our own presuppositions, our first elementary and inspectional readings, from blocking the way to any kind of genuine understanding of the texts. Here are some ways we can do this through what I call analytical reading. So one thing we can do is to notice any places in which our understanding of the text or of a specific word just doesn't feel right or is irritating. Often this is a clue to where we are presupposing something to be true that the person writing the text simply didn't presuppose or perhaps understood quite differently. This is I can't stress this enough how useful it is to pay close attention to when you read the text and something just doesn't feel right? Something doesn't seem like what you expected, for instance. A character does something that seems contrary to how you would think that they would be represented in the text. Those things, if you follow them up carefully and systematically, can often reveal a great deal about the difference between how you think about the world and how the people writing the text thought about the world. Another thing we can do, and this kind of follows the same line, is to form explicit hypotheses about what certain episodes or words mean, or why certain characters act in certain ways, what they want, and what they value. Then we can compare these hypotheses with other parts of the story or the text to see if it is either confirmed or refuted by the evidence. Right? If, for instance, your explanation in a certain part of the text is that Gilgamesh did something because he is selfish, then that Gilgamesh is a selfish individual and is to be represented as a selfish individual, it can be used as a kind of hypothesis. That's a more general statement, right? Now the question is, in all cases where his either being selfish or selfless arises, does it turn out that he also appears to be selfish, right? So you can test whether that interpretation of a specific passage coheres with all other related passages in the text. Now, say, for instance, that your hypothesis is that Gilgamesh is selfish, and almost everything in the text confirms that. You find many, many other instances where it is confirmed that Gilgamesh is a selfish individual. And then you see one instance where it appears as if he is not selfish. Well, that would be a clue that the preponderance of evidence should lead you to think that perhaps you misunderstand that particular passage because he should be selfish, right? And the evidence indicates that he should be. So that it doesn't seem that he is might mean that you need to read the passage somewhat, the odd passage somewhat differently. Another thing that one can do to try to offset the difficulties that arise because of these texts through analytical reading is not to attribute anything to the text that we know could not have been in the mind of the author. For example, don't suppose something is an example of sin when the text predates the very advent of that concept. Similarly, don't assume, for example, that a myth is supposed to provide a kind of scientific explanation of a natural phenomena when we know that the myth that myth is from a time before anyone thought about or even felt the need to explain things and how they happen in nature. We can also be aware of our own pet ideas and try to be objective, testing them by the strict evidence of the text. This is one of the most important, perhaps, things to realize, is that in reading these texts, we are invested in a certain sense. You want them to say certain things. You want them to confirm certain ideas. You want them to, in a way, reflect yourself, even if you don't consciously aren't aware of that. And for this reason, we have to kind of be suspicious of our own favorite ways of thinking about the text. And we have to, because we want those things to be true, we need to, kind of isolate them and put them to the test of textual evidence itself and be very kind of harsh with them. Finally, we can, help remedy the difficulties by being aware of the limits of our ability to understand these texts. This again is one of the most important and difficult things to do when you're reading something during this course. You will freely try to create explanations as to why characters do certain things or why certain episodes happen. And in that process, some of those things that you generate, some of those explanations that you generate for yourself, some of those will be testable. Some of those you will be able to test by comparing that hypothesis that you have with some other pieces of the text. But sometimes there simply is no way to test it. It's simply an explanation that cannot be verified or refuted. And in that case, we just have to recognize that as much as we might like to say that Enkidu or Gilgamesh or Oedipus or Odysseus did X for Y reason, there's no way to determine objectively whether that's the case or not. And so in a certain sense, there's just no answer there. There's nothing in the text to tell us what the answer is, and so there simply is no answer. So there are many, many questions you'll have about these texts where really the best position that you can reach on them is realizing there simply is no way to decide which of various possible meanings is the correct meaning, or which interpretation is the correct interpretation. There simply is no way to determine. And the desire to always know can often lead us to forget about that limitation, that we have to be able to justify everything that we think about these texts by reference to the text themselves. Okay, those are the three forms of reading. For next class, I will put on the website the reading, but you should begin reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we will start applying these three modes of reading to that text. So I'll see you next week.